Okay, this is lovely to see you again, David. It's been quite a few years since you moved over to the other side of the planet. Um, so nice to see you again and have the opportunity to interview you again.
Thank you. Yeah, you too.
So just to kick straight off, it'd be good for people to get a sense of what it is that you do. What's the purpose? How do you see the purpose of your work?
Okay, so, well, the purpose of my work really all along has been to try and encourage people to want to live more sustainably. That's always been the bedrock of it. So it's always had quite a strong change agenda or political agenda. But what I actually do is take people into wild and outdoor places and work with them so that those experiences translate into changes in their personal and their personal life and then also their social life and into leadership and so on. So yeah, that's the heart of it really, is this facilitated experiences of nature.
So that's quite an important point. You're talking about outdoor spaces. And do you see those different from what we might talk about as nature?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, nature is a hugely contested term, right? And then certainly in my community of practice, there's never-ending discussions about nature and what nature is. My feeling really is, the word nature comes from, it's the same root as the word natal, isn't it? So it's really what the matrix that we all arise from, that everything arises from. Yes, it's that original source, if you like, and in that sense, it's everything. Nature is everything. We can't, if we go out into nature, which is a common phrase, where do we go out from? There's no dualism in it. So using the word nature and saying working in nature or going out into nature doesn't actually make sense. So what I do is make it a little bit more precise by using this term outdoors, which is quite clear, to most people anyway. You could argue the point, but really for me, being outdoors means that you're out under the open sky. That's a definition, a working definition that I like, which is distinct, of course, from being in a room in buildings or in other kind of structures and environments like that. So yeah, so that's where I see the difference. So I always say I work outdoors, which makes it really clear that we're outside. We're being always in nature anyway.
Okay, and the kind of the nugget, the kind of the core of this, of the theme of this conversation is about transformative experiences. So what do you mean by that? Could you give us some examples of what that transformative experiences would be?
Yeah, for sure. I think, in my mind, again, I think it's helpful to work from our own definitions of things and I work from what I understand that to mean rather than the dictionary. For me, transformational means, or transformative means that it's about a fundamental change from one state to another. And the change is not something that's temporary. It's a transition into something new that can't be reversed. So I think that's quite important. And it's enduring in that sense, because once you've stepped through that threshold, once you've made that change, then it stays with you. So it kind of endures. And obviously there can be other changes coming up and other transformations, but essentially there's this kind of forward movement to it. So that's how I like to think of it, that this transformational process is an opening up to something new in a way that it can't be put back, it can't be reversed. Yeah.
So that's a major shift. How does that happen? What are the essential ingredients that can make an outdoor experience transformational in that sense?
Yeah, well, that's the question I set out with, really. I think, what happened for me was I was working in a completely unrelated field when I was in my early 20s, mid 20s. And I had an experience while I was rock climbing in California that fundamentally transformed my life in a very irreversible way. And I became really fascinated with what was going on there. Why did that happen to me? Why did my day out rock climbing turn me into what turned out to be a very enthusiastic environmentalist, having not been one before that point. And I didn't really know, and I didn't understand, and it was a long, long journey. I think that happened to me in 1995. And eventually I wrote my master's thesis about that experience in 2003. So there was quite a long period of time trying to work out what was going on. And really what emerged out of that master's thesis was a kind of like a recipe, really. What I did is I looked at lots and lots of accounts of people that had transformative experiences in lots of different contexts, but the common theme was that they were outdoors. And what I found was, and I mean like diverse. So right from, Catholic mysticism through to meditation practices, through to sea kayaking, through to mountaineering, through to everything you can think of, really, just about every single context. And what I found was that the accounts of these experiences were always very similar, if not the same. And what it led me to believe was that they were all descriptions of essentially the same experience, the same human experience. And so what I did is a thematic analysis on these narratives. And I came out with all these different themes, and then spent some time trying to work them into some categories, which is all very contra to my natural way of doing things. But I kind of forced myself to separate them out into categories. And I came up with these categories and realized that there were types of category that, when they came together, seemed to create these experiences that fitted these descriptions, that created these descriptions. So I kind of drew out these types and started designing programs based around them. And it worked. The more I did it, the more it worked. People came back giving similar accounts that fitted the accounts I'd researched, describing changes in their lives in certain directions. And it worked more times than not. It was reasonably successful. So anyway, so I came up with these categories, and the ingredients are, it sounds almost oversimple at the moment, but I'll get to the complicated bit in a second. The categories are the environment people are in. So there's always reference to the environment. I was sea kayaking along the coast of British Columbia, or I stepped into a 500-year-old church in Worcestershire, or I'd just done this, or I'd just done that. There were always some kind of description of where they were, where they'd been, and the environment they were in was always important, either as a negative or positive influence. Like, for example, going indoors might break the experience, whereas stepping outdoors might initiate it, and so on. So that's the first one, the environment that people are in, the physical environment. The second one was the activity. There was always a reference to what they were doing at the time. Were they meditating? Were they praying? Were they rock climbing? Were they sea kayaking? Were they standing alone? Were they, there was always something they were doing at the time. So that was the second one, activity. Another one, which is a little bit harder to find, was that they nearly always referred to the fact that they'd recently become aware of some kind of new information. So something had been disclosed to them. And it might have been an idea, it might have been another person might have said something that stimulated a thought, they might have read something, they might have seen something, and very cognitively process what they've seen as a kind of, oh, I wonder what that was, or that's interesting, or there was some kind of new information had been brought into the experience. So that was the third piece. And the final part was the social context they were in, the immediate social context. So, like, were they with a group? Was there a group of monks, or was it a peer group of friends, or was it were they alone? That as well, the juxtaposition. So there was often reference to their immediate social group, which seemed to be very, very important. And actually, it turns out later in my career, I worked out that part had a very big influence on what direction the change went into, where the transformation went, and how enduring it was often, the group part was often very important. So the group that they had the experience with, became a support structure for future changes and transformations after the initial experience. So those were the four things. And so environment, activity, disclosure, and the group context were the four categories of ingredient. And then in the middle of this, I put those in a kind of oval shape with arrows going around to show that they're kind of dynamic. And in the middle, I put this little box that said facilitation. And then felt very pleased with myself that I'd managed to finish my thesis and forgot about it for a while. And over the subsequent years, and what I realized was that the facilitation piece is actually the key to it all, and is also the most difficult and complex, at the same time as being the most subtle and simple part of the whole process. So maybe we'll come back to that later, but the point is that the facilitator brings together these ingredients in time and space, and this creates a process, and the process moves around these ingredients, and eventually it kind of spins off into what I described as a transpersonal shift. And the transpersonal shift is where the person has an experience of themselves as being part of something much greater. They see themselves as being a piece of a bigger whole. And at that point, depending on the frame of reference for the experience they're having, depending on how it's been set up and how it's been described and so on, and how it's been facilitated, that transpersonal experience can lead into a specific direction, which in my work is a realization that we're part of the rest of nature, which then when you start to make meaning out of that realization, it implies that we need to live sustainably. We're part of nature. We have to live within its limits, or we're basically not going to survive. So that's how that worked. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's lots to think about there. So nature experiences in nature, you found, are sometimes transformative, but we've got people going out and going sea kayaking and mountain climbing and walking in the woods without it leading to any dramatic personal or social change. So what's happening?
Yeah, I think that's very true. You know, outdoor recreation is the fastest growing leisure activity in the world. You know, as most of us know, it's a massive industry as well. It's kind of fallen into the consumerist shadow in many ways, and there's millions of people every day out recreating outdoors, and sure enough, they are not going home and immediately changing their lifestyles or anything at all. And I think the reason for that, well, I think there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons for that is that there is no particular frame of reference for their experience. And there's no particular underlying intention or purpose given to their experience. So the experience is it's a bit like Russian roulette, you know, that experience going out into the wilderness could change their life forever in a split second, which would be hitting the bullet in the gun, or it can have no impact whatsoever. In fact, in a lot of cases, what it's doing is it's making people feel more relaxed. As we know, outdoor experiences can be restorative. They have a lot of impacts on levels of anxiety and stress, and they can improve, they can help people who are suffering from depression, all kinds of therapeutic outcomes from being outdoors. And often that's what happens, is people will go out either consciously or unconsciously, they will receive a lot of that benefit. But what it does is it just enables them to go back into their everyday life feeling refreshed. And for most people, taking part in their everyday life is also contributing to what's happening to our planet. So in some ways, people are going out there and drawing all these benefits down, and effectively they're then making our situation worse, because they're just enabling us to cope better with the society that we shouldn't really be coping with at all. We should be changing it. So this is a big issue. And, you know, often I see people out, and in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, you know, there's a few things you could change about their day, or if that day was facilitated in a certain way, or that experience was facilitated in a certain way, I know it could potentially lead to all kinds of interesting transformations. So that's the heart of it, really. The difference is, to summarize, is that most times there isn't a meaningful frame of reference around the experience other than the existing frame of reference that we all have with us, which is a industrial growth consumerist frame of reference, where the outdoors is a palliative. It's something we can mine for our own individual personal benefit that helps us be resilient and cope with our crazy industrial lives. That's the frame, and that's the wrong, in my terms, for the kinds of changes I'm trying to work with. It's not a helpful frame. So that's why, I think.
So is it the facilitation that shifts that? How do you shift that frame from recreation to transformational?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think there's a lot to it. You know, the idea of framing. Let's talk about that, because that's really, really important. In outdoor education, which is my background, working as an outdoor instructor, back in the early 90s, there was a lot of work done around outdoor learning theory, particularly in the US. And one of the ideas that emerged out of that was this idea that's called isomorphic framing. And what you do with that is iso means the same, and frame is obviously frame. So what that's about is it's about framing the same experience in different ways in order to achieve a particular outcome. And the classic example in outdoor learning, really trite example, is you get people to buy into a metaphor. So if they're doing an outdoor activity where they have to build a little bridge or something like that and get a bucket of water from one side to the other, you know, a classic low-level outdoor team building activity, what you would do is tell them that the water in the bucket is actually liquid gold, and that every drop they spill is worth $1 million, and they have a responsibility to whoever not to lose any money, and blah blah blah. And if you frame that right, I mean, it sounds trite as an example, but if you frame that right, the people will buy into that. They will forget that there is water in that bucket. They will buy into that metaphor to such an extent that they become actually distraught if they spill any water, because they think it's money. So think it's, you know, it's gold. So these frames that you place around the experience are very, very important. You know, is it a bucket of water? Is it a bucket of gold? How do you frame that? The activity is the same, the ISO bit, but the way it's framed is fundamentally changes the nature and the outcome of the experience. Another brilliant example would be if you got a group of Zen Buddhist monks who were climbing a mountain to do a meditation. And you can imagine what that was like, you know, the process they would go through, what that would feel like, and what the outcomes of that day would be. Now, if you imagine exactly the same day, the same mountain, the same weather, the same time of year, the same bird flying past at the same time, everything is identical, except that the group is they're army cadets and they're learning how to navigate. Right, so the frame for their day is learning how to navigate in a mountain environment. So they'll walk the same route, they'll get to the same summit, they'll see the same sunset, everything's the same, but the frame is different. So you can imagine how fundamentally different the outcome of those 2 days would be. You know, one being obviously potentially this huge spiritual experience that might be memorable for a whole lifetime. The other being that you might learn a bit about pacing or how to do how to triangulate your position using a compass. Completely different, but the contents of the day are identical. It's only the frame that's changed. So as a facilitator working outdoors, what I'm doing all the time is changing the frame, working up the frame, making a frame. And I'm not really trying to control what gets painted into that frame, what the picture is. I'm just all the time working on the frame itself. And that starts right from the very first moment that somebody, say, hears about the program that I'm offering, or they look at the website, or they have a conversation with a friend who says, have you heard about this program? Even at that moment, the frame starts to get built, and it carries on being built. And as it gets built through language and through the way the nature of the experience people have, how they interact with you, and then they turn up for the course, and of course the place they're in has an impact. They meet the other people in the group, that continues to develop it. And then the frame starts to build itself. So the facilitator at that point, that's the point where the facilitator starts to move back. All right. And eventually the frame, the place becomes the dominant force in the frame. It becomes, the place starts to be the most important factor in the mix, if you like. And that's why one of the aspects of facilitating this kind of experience is kind of slightly odd, in that I always see my job as a facilitator is actually to get out of the way. My job is to try and to create a frame, to try and convene the whole process in time and space, be very present to start with, and help people feel safe and secure as they get ready to step into that frame. And then once they step through it, my job is to get out of the way and allow the rest of nature to come along and work its magic, which is very, very different to how facilitation is usually done, where there's usually a constant energy put into maintaining some kind of structure or trying to work a particular kind of model or process that's been pre-given. None of that's really present in my work. It's all about creating this frame. So that's really important. Another thing that's really important in the facilitation side is the intent of the facilitator. And, setting out, when I suppose, to speak from my own ground, whenever I set out to run a program, I know that the thing that I'm most passionate about is trying to contribute towards a sustainable future. And I know that realization has come from spending time outdoors in lots of different contexts. And so I'm aware that those two things inform my intent. I have an absolute faith that if I do my job well, these experiences of nature will help that intent. And just because I'm carrying that in my heart, actually in my body, through my body, because it's in me, in fact, it is me, that intention, which is where it becomes an archetypal intention. It's kind of bigger than just a little intention. Because that's in me, that kind of feeds out, it comes out of me, it becomes a guiding force in the process, and it's subtle and often unconscious, and in fact it can go the other way. When you meet a facilitator who isn't really aware of what their intent is, but nonetheless they end up taking the process that way because it's in them. So that's important, the intention. And for me, that intention is, in my work, is hugely informed by my own relationships with the rest of nature, how I experience those relationships and what those relationships mean to me. So it's about me being in touch with my ecological self, my ecological sense of self. Right? I need to constantly work on that relationship for me all the time, because that then enables me to work with other people. And this is the mistake I see a lot in this work, is that it's easy when things get busy, times get hard and busy, and you're running around. It's quite easy to neglect that work on yourself, and that when that happens, well, in my experience, for me personally, if I neglect that work, things start to get less effective. I become less effective at doing my work as a facilitator. So that's another piece, the intention piece. I would say the frame, I think the frame and the intention, they're really, really important. And I think the third most important part, or equally important part, is about what is, it's a technical word, but the idea of ontology, that the Rogerians would call it the way of being. Carl Rogers wrote about the way of being in a therapeutic relationship, and he spent a huge amount of his life trying to communicate what that was and why it was important. And I think it describes that very, very well. I think the way I am when I'm with my groups working outdoors has a disproportionately powerful effect on the group itself. So my level of comfort with being outdoors, the way I respond to what happens, the meaning that I make out of my experience, even the way I hold my body, the way I move through the land, the language I use, all these things create a way, and that way it informs the experience. It gives permission to do certain things, to be certain ways. It throws up questions that people then try and seek to answer. And a lot of this stuff's happening unconsciously. People often aren't aware of a lot of it. My favorite example of using a kind of way in order to communicate something is very, very practical and simple. And it's the oldest trick in the book if you're an outdoor instructor, which is where you're walking along and you see a rabbit hole in the middle of the path, and you're at the front of the group, and all you do is you just very subtly stop for a split second and look at it, and then you carry on walking, right? And nobody will step down the rabbit hole because they've taken this clue that they haven't even noticed consciously, but there's a clue has gone in, which is, oh, there's something on the ground there that I need to take care of, that Dave just noticed. And they then walk and they all look down to see what I looked at. So that's a very, very simple, shallow example of this idea of ontology. But if you kind of multiply that up a billionfold into everything you do and the way you are, what you end up doing is creating a way of being together as a group in an outdoor environment that allows new things to happen. It allows change to happen. It creates a crucible, container for things to be shaken up, for structures to come loose. That's basically how I see it. So really, that when I created that model with the 4 ingredients and I drew facilitation in the middle and then walked away and forgot about it, in the however many years it is since then, having gone deeply into that middle part, there's lots and lots of aspects to it, but the fundamentals are around intention, framing, and way of being as a facilitator. I think those are the 3 really the really big headline topics, I think, for me in that facilitation piece.
Wow, that's very rich. We're just going back to I'm just thinking about, I was struck by the idea of the Zen monks climbing the mountain, and then there's the army recruits going up the same mountain, and they're having a completely different experience of the same place. So it's sounding like you can make the same experience of nature about something quite specific. You can almost predefine your outcomes. Is that something? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, I think you can. I mean, so this opens up some interesting questions, I think, around ethics. Actually, I think you absolutely can facilitate an experience outdoors towards a certain direction. Now, I hate the term outcomes, although I use it quite a lot because everybody understands what it means. Because it suggests that an experience is going to definitely lead somewhere, and in my experience, that often isn't the case, and it would be I think the world would be very dull if the experience is always led exactly where the list of outcomes directed them. But I've already said, as you know, my purpose is about trying to encourage people to live sustainably and to lead others to live sustainably. That's the heart of it. And so I am deliberately in my work trying to manipulate people towards that action. There's no doubt about it, and I'm very clear about that. In fact, a participant on one of my programs that I ran a few years back for WWF said exactly, they were asked once in a media interview, aren't you just being manipulated by this process? And she said, absolutely, that's the whole point. so let's be clear about that. There's nothing very subtle about it. So there is a direction, and the way the way you implement that, if you like, move that direction, is through the methods I've already talked about, which is you convene these ingredients and then you facilitate them in a certain way. And deep in your own heart as the facilitator is this intention to create change in a certain direction, and you have worked hard to create a frame that is pulling people into that direction. You know, so a big frame, a big element of a frame for me is that we are part of the rest of nature. Right? So I'm constantly using language, ideas, everything really is built around trying to get that piece of the frame into the frame, that we are part of the rest of nature, we are part of the rest of nature. So that would be an example of a specific thing that you might put in that frame. And my belief is that if people then experience that they're part of the rest of nature, it creates movement towards then behaving as if we are part of the rest of nature, which of course means that we then need to behave sustainably. We need to live within the Earth's limits. So that purpose thing is important. Now, this is really interesting. Like I mentioned before about the Russian roulette idea, you know, that people could go out and recreate outdoors, and all it does is creates more resilient super consumers. Right? You know, this perhaps controversial, but one of the most successful outdoor education programs ever convened was the Hitler Youth Movement. Right. So there, what they did is they take the frame of National Socialism and nature mysticism, and they combine it with Norse mythology, which is fundamentally powerful. You're taking an archetypal idea there and bringing it into a particular political context. You build this frame around vitality and health and well-being and nation first and everything, and you do all that through spending time camping and climbing and swimming in the lake and canoeing, and all that's what happens. So there it is. I mean, incredibly powerful movement. And there are lots of other, you know, the military use outdoor experiences a huge amount as a way of encouraging a certain frame of reference, a certain way of being. And in my mind, that what they're doing is tapping into the same transformational processes that I work with. It's just that the outcome is very different. What's really fascinating, I have quite a few friends who are in the military, or have been in the military for sure. And what's really interesting is when they tell stories about their experiences out on doing close quarter surveillance and out on patrol and stuff, their experiences are very similar to some of those accounts that I studied in my master's thesis. And a lot of them have come out of the military with having been fundamentally changed, but not in a militaristic sense at all, in an unexpected way by those experiences, which I think is really interesting. It's like almost the military frame wasn't quite strong enough to hold them, and eventually those experiences have become about something else, often to do with connection to the other people they had the experience with, which is one of the ways the military uses those experiences to create really strong teams. So there's an ethical question here, which is who gets to decide what that direction is? Because, you know, Adolf Hitler got to decide in the case of the youth movement, and that obviously wasn't a good thing. You know, cults use outdoor experiences quite a lot. Camps, walks, pilgrimages, they're common practice in quite a few religious traditions. And you could say that what's happening there is they're using the outdoor experience to encourage a certain worldview. I think it's, you know, very, very much the same thing. So there's a question about ethics. Who gets to decide what the purpose of these experiences are? Who gets to hold that intention? Who gets to paint that frame? And what is the purpose of that? And I think as facilitators working outdoors, we need to constantly keep an eye on that and keep checking in with that, because it's very easy for the process to get abused through the facilitator. And it brings up the question for me in my own work about ecological validity and how I justify my deliberate attempts to manipulate people to want to live more sustainably. I justify that by saying, but it's not just to do with me, and it's not just to do with humans. What I'm trying to do is create a future that has an ecological validity, that's ecologically possible, which means that the measurement exists outside of the human individual or social sphere. The acid test of my work is, does it mean we live sustainably within our ecosystems? That's the acid test. So that's how I think about it. And when I check my own behavior, I'm always asking the question to myself, am I meeting that criteria? Am I getting myself, all my narcissisms and my personal petty desires and my need for security and all those other things, am I really making sure that they are secondary to this process of taking people into that ecologically possible future. That's the test for me. And of course, you know, we all, and I, drift with that. Sometimes we're better at that than others. And it also brings the question up, or makes the point, that a really important part of facilitating these types of processes is that facilitators need to be self-aware. I always recommend, I ran a facilitator training program a few years ago, and it involved 2 years of psychotherapy as a prerequisite, as a side part, purely for that reason, so people could work out when they were getting in the way of that larger intention, when they were simply trying to feel better about themselves, or they were transferring or projecting other things into their facilitation that were to do with them, rather than trying to become truly ecological beings. So that's very important, I think, and often gets missed. You know, I think there's a lot of people working outdoors with facilitation processes that maybe would benefit from that kind of self-awareness, or doing some of that work, which of course is ongoing and ebbs and flows. Sometimes it doesn't matter how much psychotherapy you've had or how many years you've been doing it. Of course, you always make mistakes, but it's about being able to spot that that's happened, and having the support networks to help you spot that's happened, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you very much, David. That was a real sort of tour de force. I think you've given us a good sense of what it is you're doing, and what you've learned over all the years. Any closing thought before we just wrap it up?
Yeah, well, my favorite closing thought is that if we really want to understand this stuff, that we have to go out. We have to go outdoors, and that if we can go out and we can frame it for ourselves in a way that opens up to the possibilities of transformation in those outdoor spaces, they will happen. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Great to talk to you again, and we'll look forward to talking next time. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.